Mr. Bahena and the attorneys of record are present. Mr. Romero, I will remind you, you're still under oath, but before we get back to the questioning, Exhibit D, what do we want to say regarding D?
I move to publish as previously requested.
Judge, I'm now aware that there are multiple parts, 7 parts, I think, that the defense wants to offer. My understanding of those 7 portions is that they are similar to the portions we've already seen, that there's no discussion that will be published to the jury since it's in a foreign language in Spanish. So with that representation from the defense, if they want to play those 7 portions, we don't really have an objection to it. But it is my understanding that those 7 portions show similarly what we have already seen. Does that make sense?
It does. With that record then, permission to publish granted.
Thank you. For the record, I'm starting at 4824. And I'm pausing here, Your Honor. For the record, this is at 3 times speed. Thank you. record, I am stopping at 1:03:05.
Record will so reflect.
Ma'am, at this point in time, there are two men that enter the room, is that right?
Yes.
Who are those men?
Sergeant Fink from the Iowa City Police Department and the DCI agent.
And ma'am, I'm going to take that off the screen. Was it your understanding that at that point in time, an immigration hold was put on my client?
11:30.
And in fact, when you came back, my client told you that he was under arrest for an immigration hold. Isn't that right?
I was made aware of the detainer. I do not recall him letting me know that.
Right, may I approach?
Yes.
It's all right. Go ahead.
There you go. Thank you. Ma'am, isn't it true that my client told you, and I believe tomorrow, an agent from immigration is going to come?
Yes.
He told you that he was under arrest, is that right?
He told me an agent from immigration was coming.
Now, my client's phone was taken away from him, is that right?
Yes.
He had no access, he was not free to go at that point in time, is that right?
Yes.
If he would have asked to leave, you wouldn't have let him.
He was under custody because of the ICE agent.
He wasn't told that his family was there asking about him, is that right?
I did mention to him that his family was out there.
And if he says that that is not the case, you disagree with that, is that right?
Again, the interview was recorded. I will have to review the transcripts again.
But it's what you recall is you think you told him his family was out there.
Yes, that is correct.
You never offered to let him see his family.
No, I did not.
Ma'am, there were 3 distinct times prior to this immigration hold being placed that you told my client that you were not from immigration. Isn't that right?
Yes.
The first time, and I'm looking at 17:04:34, so this would be the first interview at about 5 o'clock, you said to my client, okay, Christian, I'm going to ask you this, but first I'm going to tell you that we are not from immigration. Do you remember telling him that?
Yes, I do remember telling him that. I believe at one point Mr. Rivera mentioned, if I recall correctly, I asked him, do you know why you are here? And he goes, yes, it has to do something with immigration, correct? And that is why I was trying to make it clear to Mr. Rivera that I have nothing to do with immigration.
And you further reiterated that 2 more times, saying that he was not here for an immigration issue. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
You said again, Christian, I already told you, we aren't immigration, right?
Right, law enforcement, as far as I know, we're not part of immigration.
And then you said to again, you said, do you understand why I feel that you're keeping something from me? At this time, I'm telling you that I'm not immigration. I'm not here to judge you. You said
Again.
that to him also, isn't that right?
Yes.
And then a 4th time, while you were in the room with Officer Fink, he reiterated, we're not interested in your status or immigration. No, they want information about her. You recall that?
Yes, I do.
So they want information about what happened with Ms. Tibbetts. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Now, ma'am, you testified that you don't know anything about a false confession. Is that right?
Yes.
You don't know what the definition of a false confession is?
No, I do not.
You don't understand that concept whatsoever?
No, not at the moment, I do not.
Do you understand the position that sometimes people can say things that they don't really, that they didn't really do?
Objection, Your Honor's calls for speculation. It's outside the purview of the expertise of this witness.
Sustained.
Ma'am, you would agree with me that my client was stuck in this room for approximately 11 hours. Isn't that right?
I will agree with you. Yes, that was the approximate time of the interview.
The only food that he was given was that sandwich that this jury saw him get. Isn't that right?
That is correct. I did offer Mr. Rivera something to eat. I myself have not had any lunch since 11 a.m. in the morning.
You, excuse me, he fell asleep multiple times during breaks of this interview. Isn't that right?
According to the recording, yes. During my presence, no.
Now, there's other times during, and I'm happy to play them for you, ma'am, but basically anytime there was a break, he put his head down or leaned back and went to sleep. Isn't that right?
That is what we are seeing in the recording, yes.
My client was aware that he could be deported back to Mexico. Isn't that right?
I'm going to object. This calls for speculation as to what Cristhian Rivera thought.
Sustained.
Ma'am, you told my client multiple times that you were not from immigration. Isn't that right?
Yes, I did.
And you told him that because he was an illegal immigrant. Isn't that correct?
He explained his status at the beginning of the interview to me, yes.
And you understand that if someone is illegally in this country, that they can be deported. Isn't that right?
Yes and no.
You don't understand what an ICE hold is, ma'am?
Yes, I do.
What's an ICE hold?
Judge, I'm going to object to relevance.
Overruled. Witness may answer if she knows.
ICE hold, it can be that, you have a retainer from ICE agent.
So it's something that someone that's alleged to be illegally in this country is held in custody. Isn't that right?
Yes,
And it's your understanding an ICE hold was put on my client at 11:30 p.m. that night. Isn't that right?
that is correct, 11:30.
Now, ma'am, you are aware of no statements whatsoever that my client tried to sexually assault Mollie Tibbetts, correct?
Correct?
He never indicated anything to the fact that he tried to sexually assault Mollie Tibbetts. Is that right?
Correct.
There's no evidence that you're aware of that he attempted to sexually assault Mollie Tibbetts. Is that right?
I'm going to object as it calls for speculation on this witness's behalf.
Sustained.
You interviewed my client for 11 hours, correct?
Yes,
And during that time, you presented my client with different theories of what could have happened. Is that right?
yes,
And you were provided information from law enforcement about the evidence that they were gathering. Is that right?
yes,
The evidence that they were gathering from my client's vehicle was being gathered simultaneously to this interview. Is that right?
yes,
And there was no information that you were given that my client sexually assaulted Mollie Tibbetts, correct?
that is correct.
And he never made any statements that he did that. Is that right?
The sexual reference that he made towards her was Mr. Rivera stated he found her attractive. I found her hot.
And if you find someone attractive, it's somewhat of a leap to say that you're going to sexually assault them. Is that right?
Object calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Ma'am, in any event, you said that there was no information on this that you had that my client intended to sexually assault Mollie Tibbetts. Is that correct?
Objections now asked and answered.
Overruled. The witness may answer.
Go ahead.
Can you repeat the question?
Carrie, would you mind reading that? Thank you. Ma'am, in any event, you said that there was no information on this that you had that my client intended to sexually assault Mollie Tibbetts. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Ma'am, how many interviews approximately, and I'm not going to hold you to it, but an estimate, did you do in your capacity as a law enforcement officer?
Approximately, I will say informal or formal.
Any type of interview?
In my law enforcement career, I will go ahead and say more than 20 times. I mean, all the times that we get to a call of service is an investigation and interview.
How many times have you had an interview that lasted 11 hours?
None.
How many times have you had an interview that lasted 10 plus hours?
None.
How many times have you had an interview that lasted 9+ hours?
I
Zero.
want to object to the form of the question. She's already answered that she's not been in a long interview. We don't have to count it down.
Sustained.
Well, let's start with this then. How many times have you been in an interview that lasted over an hour?
4 times.
How many times have you been in an interview that lasted over 2 hours?
Approximately 4 times.
How many times have you been in an interview that lasted over 3 hours?
Approximately 4 times.
All right. Let me guess that all those times you were interviewing suspects.
Yes.
And would it be fair to say that when you are interviewing suspects that those interviews are longer?
Yes.
Because the first thing that you do is you rapport build, correct? You talk to the client, or
That
you
is
talk to
correct.
the suspect.
Yes.
And then you start to confront them with different pieces of evidence. Is that right?
That is correct.
And here you confronted my client with different pictures of surveillance camera. Is that right?
Correct.
You also confronted him that there was hair in the vehicle. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you don't know whether or not that was a false statement. Is that correct?
Correct.
That was just information that law enforcement was giving you to tell Mr. Rivera.
That is correct.
And you relied on that information that they were telling you the truth, right?
I was just relying on the information that they were giving me.
It's important for you to get a good confession. Is that right?
That is the goal of the interview, to get the truth out of that.
You want the truth, not someone just to say what you want them to say. Is that right?
We are looking for the truth.
Now, the blackout that was suggested here, that was your suggestion to Mr. Rivera that he might have some sort of a condition. Isn't that right?
That is, I do not recall that. That is not correct.
So you don't believe that. Is that right?
Correct.
All right. How many times, well, let me ask you this. Are you certified to be an interpreter?
No, I am not.
So like these two nice people right here that are interpreting for my client, Mr. Rivera, you understand they have special qualifications, correct?
I believe so.
And that's so that they can interpret a good record in court. Is that right?
Correct.
Do you have any sort of qualifications to interpret a statement?
No, I do not, other than the fact that I have been interpreting since I was 11 years old.
Did Mr. Rivera ever provide any information to you that he had been stalking Ms. Tibbetts?
No,
He said that he had driven by her 3 different times. Is that right?
that is correct.
But he said that he had never met her, right?
Yes,
There was no information that you had that he had followed her around in the days or nights leading up to this. Is that right?
not prior to the date that I show him in the picture, no.
The information that you had was that he had driven by her 3 times, correct?
That is the information that Mr. Rivera provided, yes.
Then he had gotten out to talk to her. Is that right?
At that particular point of the conversation, he did not agree to stop to talk to her.
Well, at a point at the end of the interview, when you were at the cornfield, he said he got out to talk to her. Is that right?
He said he parked his vehicle behind her. He started jogging after her, and that is when he made contact with her. Apparently, Mollie turns around, intends to call the police or intends to use the phone. Mr. Rivera stated she tried to call the police. That is when I got angry, and that is when we started fighting.
So at no point when he was driving around beforehand did he report that he was angry with her.
No,
At no point when he's getting out of his vehicle did he report that he was angry at her.
no,
At no point when he's walking up to her trying to say hello did he report that he was angry to her.
no. Mr. Rivera made it clear that that the way that I understood it got him angry when she intended to call the police.
So it was just a quick thing that made him angry is what he told you.
Objection to the form of the question calls for speculation as to what a quick thing is.
Sustained.
What is it that made him angry?
Mr. Rivera told me this is the way he put it. I was behind her. She noticed that I was behind her. She intended to use her cell phone. She stated that she was going to go ahead and call the police. That is when I got angry and we started fighting. That was his words.
So it was when she decided to call the police. Is that correct?
That was my understanding.
This interview was 11 hours long. Is that right?
Yes.
You said that you were very tired by the end of it.
We were all tired, yes.
The training that you have in interviewing is 16 hours total. Is that right?
That is correct.
No further questions.
Mr. Brown, any redirect?
Judge, before I go ask questions on redirect, there is a record that we need to make concerning the scope of those questions I would like for you to hear. Can we take a break for me to make that record?
The answer is yes. Members of the jury will take a break at this time. We'll shoot for 10 to 15 minutes. Want to remind you of your admonition. And again, you can leave your notebooks where they are. Carry on. Yes, I'm going to have you go with them.
Judge, are we going to be back in chambers to do this, or are we going to do it here? It's clear.
I can move on.
Okay, thank you.
Can she step down or does she?
Yes, Ms. Romero, you can step down. Sorry. Yeah. All right, we're on the record. Outside the presence of the jury, Mr. Bahena is present along with the attorneys of record. Mr. Brown, you had a record you wish to make.
I do, Judge. Prior to this trial, there was a hearing relating to the suppression of certain statements that Mr. Rivera made. There was a Miranda violation that was found by the court.
Sorry, Your Honor, my equipment is not on.
There was a suppression hearing, and certain statements of the defendant were suppressed based upon a Miranda violation. Those included the statements that occurred at 4:30 a.m. Whenever they left the sheriff's office, went to Yerby Farms, and then went to the field. Those were all at the direction of the defendant. The officers had no idea where Mollie Tibbetts' body was located. He directed them to that location in the dark. When the officers could not find the body of Mollie Tibbetts in the corn where he pointed out where she was at, he was taken to the edge of the corn He was handcuffed at the time and indicated, with Ms. Romero standing right next to him, where her body was located. So Ms. Romero can testify to that. Those statements right now, the jury has not heard based upon the court's prior order. The defense spent considerable amount of time cross-examining Pamela Romero over the defendant's sleep deprivation, the deportation detainer, all of that testimony, repeatedly asked her questions about it. It is our belief now that the statements of the defendant are now admissible as impeachment and rebuttal to any argument that the defense is setting up that because he was sleep deprived, he falsely confessed. There is no other reason that the defense offered that testimony than to argue later that the sleep deprivation evidence is that he falsely confessed. They have now pushed back in the statements that the court has excluded. We would ask to be allowed to inquire with Ms. Romero as to what those statements were, the directions the defendant gave them, the location of the body, and his mannerisms and pointing at the edge of the cornfield, indicating where Mollie Tibbetts was located. We would ask, I'm doing this outside the presence of the jury because obviously there's a prior court order that suppresses that type of information, and but we believe now, based upon the cross-examination of the defendant, that the defense has made that relevant to impeach this notion that he was somehow sleep deprived and falsely confessed, any insinuation that he falsely confessed. So we would ask to be allowed to re-examine her on those questions that are currently suppressed, as I've outlined. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Defense?
Your Honor, I think that at this point, first, it's premature. There may be a point, and I don't think that we've reached it, that the court says, hey, you've opened the door and it should be allowed for impeachment. But for Mr. Brown to insinuate that we are not able to present a defense, for us to insinuate that for us to be limited insinuating that our client was not sleep deprived, when you saw in that video that he was sleeping throughout the breaks on the interview. Ms. Romero admitted that there were other points that he was sleeping during breaks. The coercive interrogation techniques that were used, the 11-hour time period that was used, are certainly things that the defense should be able to, and frankly, must be able to, in Mr. Bahena's right to submit a defense. The other thing is, I think that it's common sense that with Ms. Romero, her testimony, I think that it's common sense that someone who has been working all day and who has kept awake all night, that they would be tired, and that simply wasn't Ms. Romero's testimony. Here I'd point out, too, is that the statements that we asked for, there was no testimonial statements that were offered or introduced by my client during that period of suppression. I was very careful to make sure that the questions that I asked were in reference to questioning that happened outside of that period of suppression. So we don't agree with the state's position. Thank you.
We'll go ahead and take a recess, and before we bring the jury back in, I'll give you my thoughts. Thank you.
If I may just give you a case. Hang on just a second. The case I can find that's the closest on this is State versus Weaver, 608 Northwest 2nd, 797 at 806. It's a 2000 Iowa Supreme Court case. In that case, on the defendant's cross-examination of a Division of Criminal Investigation agent, an agent testified that he had analyzed no fingernail scrapings from the defendant Weaver. There was another officer's testimony that was offered to rebut that implication that the state had failed to preserve evidence. Although that situation is different, that is analogous to this particular situation in that we are not trying to limit their defense, but we are allowed to impeach it if they're going to offer it. They made that decision, not me. We specifically avoided these statements because of the court's prior order. And as I said before, we think now it's relevant as impeachment that he was somehow sleep deprived and falsely confessed. It directly contradicts that.
Take a brief break, and again, before we bring the jury back in, I'll give you my thoughts.
May I say one last thing?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'd point out that we are not offering any evidence in this case. What the court has heard with Ms. Romero is merely cross-examination. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, we'll take your break.